And if you look at the glyph, to be more precise, you're seeing a circle with horns. You're seeing spirit, totality, potential, horned. The horns are emergence. The horns are rising form of spirit into potential, into matter. Taurus is spirit fixed into matter.
Hey everyone, greetings from the Pacific Northwest. You're listening to Symbolic Studies episode 16. I'm your host Mario, once again joined by my partner in crime, my lovely wife Michelle. Today we'll be discussing the symbolism of Taurus, the second sign of the zodiac. If you're new to the show, we play voicemails from special guests and listeners like yourself. If you'd like to have access to early and exclusive content, please consider becoming a member on my site, Patreon, YouTube, or on the Symbolic Studies Substack. All of those links can be found at symbolicstudies.com. But before we dive into these voicemails, Michelle, my lady, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I am awesome. I really do feel like I'm in my element during spring, and particularly during Taurus season, because I have a very fond relationship with this sign. In fact, I think it may be my favorite sign of all time. And I think it's fascinating that there are several pantheons out there where the bull or cow was the first creature created. So to me, that's very telling. So we'll be getting into that and plenty of other things. But to kick things off, we got a voicemail from Jord, one of our special guests for this episode.
In order to understand Taurus properly, I think it helps to imagine or to envisage somewhere very physical, very active, very material. Picture, if you will, the slums of New Delhi. Rickshaws weaving through impossibly tight gaps, like motorbikes cutting across each other with no regard for road traffic rules or lanes, vendors shouting in the hot, humid heat, dust heavy in the air. Everything is in motion, everything is negotiating, everything is unstable. And then a cow walks into the road. Everybody halts, everything slows down, everything stops. Chaos kind of reorganizes itself around a cow. And if the cow decides that it wants to take 15 minutes to cross the road, if the cow decides that that particular spot in the middle of the road is where it will be a suitable resting place for the rest of the day, then everything will have to reorganize itself around the cow, the steadfast, slow-moving cow. That's Taurus. It's mass, it's gravity. And that's why the bull is such a powerful symbol. I think of all of all the zodiac signs that are represented by animals, Taurus is the most fitting. Perhaps it would be good to say the elephant. Perhaps it would be good to think of the mammoth or something, some other larger animal that also cannot be moved. But the bull does a pretty great job. And if you look at the glyph, to be more precise, you're seeing a circle with horns. You're seeing spirit, totality, potential, horned. The horns are emergence. The horns are rising form of spirit into potential, into matter. Taurus is spirit fixed into matter. Taurus obviously being ruled by Venus. And when we think of Venus, there's a tendency to think of romance and the pretty things and flowers neatly organized and arranged. But that is more Libra, at least to me, that is more the masculine side of Venus. In Libra, relational beauty, organized in relation to everything else, artificial beauty, man-made beauty. But Taurus is the female side of Venus, is the natural beauty side of Venus. The side of Venus that doesn't chase things, it attracts things, and therefore it doesn't have to look pretty and organized. I think in the world today, we're seeing a massive shift away from natural Taurian beauty, much more towards man-made artifice, much more towards a Libran kind of beauty. But Taurus, nevertheless, very beautiful. And with it comes these connotations of Venetian beauty and Venetian sensuality, food, land, money, the body itself, particularly the neck, which seems to be that thing that connects the brain to the body. All the domains of Taurus, because these are all things you can see and you can touch and you can taste. They're sensual things that you don't have to imagine, things you can own, things you can possess. there's a sacred weight to that, and there's a sacred weight to the idea of the bull. It's actually cross-cultural, it's cross-time too, and that the bull is never quite just an animal. There is always some kind of spiritual connotations to the cow. In Egypt, very much so. In the Minoan culture, very much so. In Mesopotamia, even in the Bible, with the golden calf, very much so. Different expressions of the same idea. Power made physical in the world. Take something abstract and Venetian, like beauty, like desire, like worth, and you make it material. Aries, very much I am. Taurus, very much I have. Once you have something, you can build on it, or you can become trapped by it. But either way, it sort of resists change. Once it has something, it has something. Very, very slow to move. Once it's moving, once it's in motion, terrifying potentially. I mean, who wants to be charged at by a bull running at 50 kilometers per hour? Now, bull is a very calm animal, very still and very grounded animal, but it is capable of sudden, overwhelming force. And I think this is important because, Taurus as a sign, Taurian people with a lot of Taurian placements don't tend to express things quickly. They build things, they store things, and they condense things down. They commit to stuff, usually over time. But cross cultures, you see this, and the bull is unanimously sacred. If you really want to understand Taurus, you have to think of a bull walking across a field full of cows. They're his cows. It's very much his territory. It's very much not a good idea to wander into a field with said bull in it, waving a red flag. There's a great association in Taurus of fertility because Taurus is a very fertile time of year. The crops that we sort of put in the ground earlier are now sort of shooting through the soil. And here we get a lot of connections to gardens and to growth. You have to think of Taurus in a very literal, material, practical, but undeniable sense. You have to go back to the bull. The bull is not just strong, it's virile. It's full of breeding power. And that force kind of continues in that time of year. If you think of the way that a field will yield crops, or the way that an animal reproduces, or the way that the human body generates pleasure and life, these are all sort of the same symbol. And if you connect it back to Venus again, not Venus in the kind of abstract Libra beauty sense, but in a sensual, fertile sense, touch, taste, pleasure, growth, and to a certain extent abundance. If you think of a blooming garden full of flowers, you can start to understand Taurus. Now, every sign obviously has its positive attributes, its good qualities, but there's a negative side and a shadow side to Taurus, because with growth comes overgrowth. With growth comes excess often, or indulgence often. And sometimes abundance doesn't always lead to growth. Sometimes it leads to decay in a weird way. There is such a thing as too much comfort. There is such a thing as too much attachment to worldly pleasures. And you can depend too much on material things. Symbolically, when you look at Taurus, what's hidden in there is fertility and abundance, but also overindulgence and over-attachment to things. Lots and lots of growth, but steady, slow growth that sometimes can look like stagnation. You have to think of a bull grazing through a field, slowly consuming, sustaining itself, giant fucking thing, sustaining itself on grass. When I think of Taurus, I picture, yes, large fields full of like abundant wheat or like verdant crops, but I also think of grain silos or maybe gold reserves. Fort Knox is actually a very Taurian thing. There's something about Taurus ruling over the mouth and the neck, and I guess the fat deposits on the body. I've noticed a weird synchronicity with Taurian women being very, very beautiful, but often slightly overweight. Tied to that abundance and that growth is security, the ability to accumulate stuff and then to survive based on what you've accumulated, and to want to protect what you've accumulated, to the point perhaps of being a little bit possessive of the things that one owns. I think the deepest symbolic abstraction of the sign is the idea of gravity. And you see this is not so much a metaphorical thing as a literal thing. Taurian people really do just take up space, the places they go, even when they aren't physically very intimidating. Even when they're quite unassuming, they tend to have a real psychogravity, a real presence to them. They kind of pull things towards them. They hold things around them. The gravity principle, I think, is a core energetic principle behind the sign. These people kind of weigh a lot. But behind all that, there is kind of like a darker, symbolic layer where value is visible and tangible, but like that could be mistaken for ultimate value and ultimate truth. A good thing to do is to look at the opposite sign and to look at Scorpio. And to look at to kind of understand that the axis that runs between Taurus and Scorpio is about value. Taurus being the obvious value, the visible value, what you can see, your bang for your buck, how much things really cost, and Scorpio being the hidden value, the value people don't perceive. There's a lesson in there that perhaps there's a lesson in the story of the golden calf, which isn't just a biblical story. It's a story that repeats all the way back through kind of prehistory. It's a symbolic warning that you can perhaps mistake the material for reality, that you can perhaps mistake the form of the thing for the deeper meaning, that if you're not careful you can become the things that you worship. With Taurus, there's always a risk of the material becoming sacred along the way. Taurus seems very, very simple on the surface, but there's a lot of weight and heaviness and gravity underneath. In fact, that's what it is. It's the symbol of weight and the symbol of value and the symbol of continuation over time. Perhaps this is why we see Taurus so prevalently in the charts of so many tyrants and so many dictators. I think if you did a Google Ngram search for the top 20 dictators of all time, most notorious tyrants and authoritarian leaders, you'd find Taurus come up a lot. There is a shadow side to possession. There is a darkness in the sign. There's a problem perhaps when we mistake the material for something more meaningful. But I just want to thank Mario and Michelle for letting me do this again. It's an absolute pleasure to talk about the zodiac. My name is Jord. You can find me on YouTube at Jord.
All right, Jord, thank you so much for that submission. It's awesome hearing your take on the sign here. I love the fact that you started with Indian symbolism and New Delhi and their reverence for the cow/bull. And I just have to say that one of the pivotal points in my life was going to India. And this is when I really started diving into cow and bull symbolism because it was all over the place. One of the things I learned with that is that they consider the cow to be the second mother of mankind. And it's really not hard to see why. There's so much abundance that comes with having a cow. Obviously, we receive milk, and from there you have cheese and ghee and yogurt and things like that. They use dung to an amazing degree in India. Cow's dung is a whole entire industry over there. And even the urine of the cow is considered to be sacred. Also, just have to say that I was recently reading Vedic lore about the cow existing in the center of the wheel and basically being related to axial symbolism. So the axis in the middle of the wheel, which causes the whole entire wheel to turn. This is a subject that I've gone on about in multiple presentations now, but there's something to be said about deities that are found to be related to the center. And it's no surprise that the cow has been associated with that. We also have ideas like the bull of heaven, the Taurus field. I think it's fascinating that we refer to the Taurus field as such. Also, I'm really glad he emphasized this idea of weight and gravity being associated with Taurus. That's obviously completely relevant and in play. What I find to be pretty intriguing about that is if Taurus is associated with weight and gravity and is associated with Venus, isn't it interesting that the sign that really, really relates to weights and measures in Libra, the scales, is also ruled by Venus? So to me, that's something worth noting. Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying our discussion on Taurus symbolism so far. If you aren't already aware, I have a series called Symbolic Secrets that's only available for members. I've released 19 episodes so far. Each one is a full-length symbolic lecture on all of the major arcana cards from the Fool to the Moon cards, with the remaining cards coming this year. That's nearly 20 hours worth of exclusive video lectures. You can access all of these videos with a membership on Patreon, YouTube, Substack, or my website. Head on over to symbolicstudies.com for the links. Membership, by the way, is also the perfect way to support the show for just $5 a month. This also gets you early access to every podcast, like the one you're listening to right now. All right, back to our episode on the symbolism of Taurus.
Well, speaking of the gifts of the cow, I have a quote from Barbara Walker from her book Woman's Dictionary of Symbols and Sacred Objects that goes into this. She states, "The universe was curdled from the primordial sea of milk, from the goddess as cow, according to one creation myth. The same story was told in Scandinavia, where the cow of creation was Adumla, whose name means creator of earth. From her udders flowed the 4 primordial rivers, 4 streams of milk, that nourished the oldest race of beings." She goes on to say, "In fact, the ubiquitous image of the 4 rivers of paradise, which appear shortly after the creation, even in the Bible, Genesis 2:10 through 2:14, seems to have been based on the observation that a cow's udder has 4 teats."
Yeah, there you go. That's really interesting. That's kind of what I'm talking about with the Vedic interpretation of the cow being at the center. Because when you really get into paradise symbolism, we're talking about the center, which is why a lot of cultures essentially have either directly mentioned or alluded to their paradise being at the north. And so if you have a concept of the center of the world, which a lot of groups have their own interpretation of that, you know, you're basically saying that this is where heaven and earth meet, and from there, you know, the 4 cardinal directions emanate. So in this case, the 4 cardinal directions symbolically can be interpreted as the 4 rivers, you know, emanating from paradise. Also, I'll say that there are older Egyptian images where a group of people are underneath the cow, and the cow has stars within its body. And so therefore the cow is taking on this divine bull of heaven, cow of heaven sort of dynamic. And it's a direct correspondence with the firmament. They're all standing underneath the cow. They are surrounded by 4 legs. And so this would be symbolically what people have referred to as the 4 corners of earth, you know, things like that. So the number 4 has a huge, huge relationship with earth symbolism. So it makes a lot of sense that the 4 udders relate to these 4 rivers. And I think that the 4 legs of the cow actually symbolically in those interpretations, in those depictions, kind of basically say something very similar. I also love what Jord said regarding the glyph for Taurus. Beautifully put, that this is spirit or totality horned. That the circle represents spirit and it is horned. So that is incredibly powerful. I've never heard it put quite like that, but I love that. Also, this idea of natural beauty versus artificial beauty, I think is really interesting and completely relevant. In some ways, it reminds me of the goddess Terawet in Egypt as well. She is a large hippopotamus and she has big saggy breasts. And so she is an embodiment of this natural beauty. She's an embodiment of sort of the everyday mother, not the artificial beauty that he was talking about being more aligned with Venusian Libra symbolism.
Yes, I'm so glad that Jord went there and you brought this up, because it reminds me of a quote that I have here from the Zodiac and the Salts of Salvation, where they say the word Taurus or Taurus means any round swelling or protuberance, a projecting part or cushion. Now, when I think of this, it makes me think of the round hips of a woman. It also makes me think of pregnancy, fertility, maidenhood, the land, and then the ancient goddess statues that most people are aware of, where the upper half of the woman is actually quite slender. And then once you get past down her waistline, her hips are just protruding out. And it's very obvious that that is a source or a point of wisdom when you see that, in my opinion. And it's kind of a symbol of a woman that's lived a life. She has experiences and she holds it in her hips. And it's almost kind of like not a rite of passage as a woman, because not every woman has large hips, but I think that it's part of the woman's anatomy to have that shapely figure.
Yeah, of course. And in case you forgot, those figures are often called Venus statues.
Ah, yes.
So there you go. And I actually talked about this. The way a lot of them look, I decoded that in some of my Libra presentations because it's ruled by Venus.
Well, and one of the other things that it brings to mind is something I brought up to you a week or two ago when I was just observing the garden, and I was noticing the shape of the plant motherwort when she's just in the early stages of coming up from the ground. And I was looking at the motherwort from a distance, and I thought, man, she has a really bulby shape to her when she's young. And it made me think of the goddess statue. And motherwort is usually tied to Leo, but it is a Venusian plant. And it has a lot to do with the heart, and it's in the name, mother. It's mother's wort. It's the motherwort that brings comfort, and it brings that motherly energy that, you know, we all could use a little more of sometimes.
Yeah, exactly right. Once again, the cow being the second mother of mankind. And I just have to say, I'm inclined to think that older representations, older interpretations of Taurus align it with the cow. And in today's world, people tend to see the masculine, aggressive bull. And so that's more of modern people's interpretation of things. But let's not forget that Taurus is ruled by Venus. So to me, that is, of course, the biggest clue that the feminine correspondence is the original correspondence.
Hello, Mari and Michelle. Just calling in to chat about Taurus season, the fixed earth yin or feminine sign ruled by Venus. Gosh, where do I even begin, guys? Because this is no doubt one of my favorite signs. And, well, I guess my Substack name, The Venus Diaries, says it all, right? So first, I want to start from an astronomical lens to better understand this sign by appreciating how the ancient astronomers used this constellation and how that potentially influenced later on its astrological correspondences and mythologies, even tracing this Taurus constellation as far back as pre-written, prehistorical times. So today, if we looked up at the sky at the Taurus constellation, and the modern depiction of it sort of reminds me of a tuning fork. It has this Y shape, a bit like a slingshot, and it's composed of two star clusters, the Pleiades and the Hyades. Now, the Hyades are a star cluster along that V-shape neck or part of the constellation, very close to what's commonly known as the Eye of the Bull, the red giant variable star Aldebaran, which comes from the Arabic meaning follower, as Aldebaran is always seeming to be following or pursuing both the Hyades and Pleiades clusters, which are located to the east of him. Now, due to the Taurus constellation's position on the ecliptic, this makes the Hyades and Pleiades clusters visible pretty much anywhere in the world, in both hemispheres, and particularly the Pleiades are not surprisingly featured in nearly every culture's mythology. The Pleiades cluster itself is made up of over 3,000 stars, but on average, 6 to 7 stars are visible to most people with just the naked eye. But sometimes, with ideal atmospheric conditions, 12 or more stars can be seen to the unaided eye. Now, most of us tend to limit ancient astronomy to mainly as a navigational tool, which no doubt the Greeks and the Maori of New Zealand did use the Pleiades as navigational stars. In fact, some trace the etymology of the Pleiades to the Greek word to sail, as the Greeks marked the start of their sailing season by the heliacal rising of the Pleiades in the early morning. Now, others argue that their name comes from the ancient Greek word for doves, marking the spring season's return of the migratory flocks of birds and the notable increase in birdsong. Interestingly, the dove is one of the oldest emblems for Inanna, the planet Venus, in Mesopotamia. In Australia, some Aboriginal tribes associate the Pleiades to a beehive, denoting the time to harvest honey. But the ancient astronomers also used these stars, the Pleiades and the Hyades, in their ceremonial calendars, to mark the best times for sexual intercourse, initiation rites for both boys and girls, as well as part of the food economy, politics, and for weather prediction. Across many cultures, even still used today, from the high slopes of the Andes in Peru to China to the Australian Aboriginals, they all linked the Pleiades clusters to seasonal rainfall predictions, calculating it in terms of the cluster's visibility by how dim or bright, which indicated whether or not there was a presence of ice crystals or moisture in the atmosphere. And let's not forget that rainfall equates to the land's fertility and regeneration. In fact, I've heard that many associate thunder gods to bulls, or with bulls, probably because, the bellowing sound that bulls make or the pounding of their hoofs in a stampede sort of resembles the sound of thunder rolling in the distance. Curiously, the word Hyades is Greek meaning rain bringers or the rainy ones, which leads me to think that the ancient Greeks used them in a similar capacity. Now, if we look at far northern Canada, we find the Inuit, and for them, the star Aldebaran is called Nanook, which means polar bear, and he represents the spirit of the polar bear, because for these people, he was a bear god, worshipped by hunters as they believed mankind are descendants of bears, because anatomically they can walk on two legs upright, but also their paws have 5 fingers like we do. And in many other indigenous cultures, particularly here in Australia where I'm based, Aldebaran was also associated with fire magic and fire ceremonies. In fact, the Aboriginals wove this into their stories about the star's variable brightness, long before the Europeans in the medieval times had first recognized that some stars are variable stars, in that they have this cyclical change to their brightness. And let's not forget that the torrid meteorite showers occur near this part of the sky. Again, reiterating the concept of fire. Now, Taurus opposes the Scorpio constellation, which we may remember is close to or borders the galactic center. Thereby, this makes Taurus the galactic anti-center along this axis. Now, this makes me wonder if the Artemis bow in the Thoth deck Hierophant card is alluding to this axis, to the galactic center. Interestingly, about 4,500 years ago, around 2300 BC, when the star Thuban in Draco constellation was the pole star, the location of the spring equinox occurred in the middle of what astronomers term the Golden Gate of the ecliptic. And the Pleiades cluster was super close to the equinoxial point, because this was during the time of the age of Taurus, when the spring equinox was in Taurus constellation. You see, what makes the Pleiades and Hyades clusters particularly fascinating to astronomers is that they are both situated within a zone of 6 degrees above and below the ecliptic, which happens to coincide with the path of the moon at 5 degrees. So not only does the moon pass between the pillars of these two clusters every month, but interchangeably, cyclically, the moon occults or covers one of these clusters on a lunar standstill, as does it to the star Aldebaran, one of the royal stars. No wonder in astrology we find the moon is exalted in Taurus. Some archaeoastronomers, in fact, propose that we can trace the Taurus constellation to Paleolithic man. It has been deduced that the Hall of Bulls, which is this large rock art in the Lascaux caves in France, is a prehistoric sky map that is 17,000 years old, to when Vega was the pole star. There's even an auroch bull that has clusters of dots near its eye and some just further away that these archaeoastronomers have mapped, and they align to the Pleiades and Hyades clusters. So it seems we are beginning to find proof of zodiacal constellations of the Paleolithic sky being mapped out by early hunter-gatherers who seemed to have been tracking the seasonal changes in the fauna and flora through the stars. Now, finally, I want to briefly discuss the number 5 and the sacred geometry of it in relation to the planet Venus. And to help illustrate this, I will later refer to the geometry encoded in the hierophant card of the Thoth deck. Now, Venus, as many may already be familiar with, from a geocentric point of view, that is, if we're standing here on Earth and we are tracking the transits of Venus through her 5 synodic cycles over 8 Earth years, actually maps out a pentagram known as the petal of Venus or the Venus rose. So we have the 5:8 ratio here. Now the rose is not like the typical rose modern day version. The primordial wild rose originally has 5 petals. Now Venus and Earth also coincidentally have another an 8:13 ratio, in that for every 8 times the Earth circles the sun, Venus has gone around the sun 13 times in 8 Earth years. So we have the 5, the 8, and the 13 ratios, and we may recall that these are all consecutive integers in the Fibonacci sequence, which is converging towards the golden ratio. Venus, the planet, and in mythology, has long been associated with beauty, symmetry, and harmony. Heck, even the Greek myth of Aphrodite, who has a daughter with the god Ares, called Harmonia. Pentagonal symmetry is the flagpole of life. It conforms to self-replicating, regenerative life forms, and we can find it all around us in nature, and of course encoded within the human anatomy, conforming to this golden mean. We can spot this self-replication at different scales in the 3 stars that we see overlaid onto the Crowley deck hierophant card. And not forgetting that the word hierophant comes from the Greek hiero, meaning sacred, and the word phanis for light. So it literally means the sacred light bringer, or the bringer of the sacred light. And that reminds me of Lucifer, the light bringer, the morning star. So on the card, going back to the Thoth deck, we find 2 large elongated or starburst shapes patterned over the hierophant. The largest star, in fact, his 2 points actually extend well outside the borders of the card if we were to draw it. The 2 largest stars are enclosing a 3rd smaller star, which is an equilateral star, a pentagram. And contained within it is a child, thought to be in reference to the child Horus, son of Isis, Venus. And this notion of fertility and beauty contained within the principles of the pentagon's regenerative qualities aligns perfectly to the mythic archetype of Inanna, Venus, Hathor, Isis, and the Virgin Mary, and all goddesses of love, fertility, and associated with the resurrection of life. Now, speaking of the Virgin Mary, we have the rosary, coming from the Latin word rosarium, meaning a rose garden or a rose garland. And what is a rosary? It's composed of 5 decades. And this brings me to the idea of the quintessence, captured within the Platonic solid, the dodecahedron, which consists of 12 pentagonal faces. Again, we're finding the 5-sided shape, the pentagon. For the Platonist, the dodecahedron is the closest of the 5 forms, having the volume of the monad's perfect square. This idea of the 5 as a bridge between spirit and matter actually coincides with some research I've been doing for my May Substack essay, where I'm going to be looking at the symbolism encoded within the famous fashion designer Coco Chanel's iconic perfume, Chanel No. 5. In this context, we find perfume, a scent long associated into antiquity to the concept of divinity. And would you know, Venus rules over fragrances and perfumes. And like the Hebrew letter associated with the hierophant card, Vav, which literally means a tent peg, a nail, or a hook. Now, this also reminds me of the Sumerian descent of Inanna, where Inanna is hung on a peg or a hook for a few days as a corpse. But let's get back to the Vav. In the Hebrew language, Vav also acts as a conjunction word, as the word and, which we use all the time grammatically to connect sentences and words. This makes Vav a bridging word. And in most cultures, the divine breath is what animates life. And in this sense, the scent of the breath, which Venus happens to govern the olfactory nerve. Now, the olfactory nerve, its primary function is to detect and transmit information about scents or smells from the nasal cavity to the brain. Now, it's true that the Scorpio, the opposite sign of Taurus, rules over the nose, and that in itself is governed by Mars. Now, historically, religious rites like birth and death have revolved around the use of sacred scented oils and burning incense. Scent is a non-verbal, innate knowing. Our brains can instantly identify thousands of scents. It's deeply tied to our memories and emotions as well. A scent is ephemeral. It's invisible. You can't completely grasp it, but it evokes presence without form. And so spiritually, one can link the scent to the spirit world, to the soul essence that can be perceived without directly grasping or seeing. No surprise then that many modern day perfumes are formulated on many of the ancient sacred ingredients like rose, sandalwood, myrrh, and frankincense, and even the sexual excretions of animals, like the musky scent of smell, literally. Like we get the musk scent from the stag deer. I find this so fascinating since the sexual secretions originate from the sexual organs, which in medical astrology corresponds to Scorpio, ruled by Mars. Again, the opposing sign to Taurus. But I'm running out of time, so I'm going to end it on this note until next episode. But I just want to say thank you so much again, Mara and Michelle, for having me be a part of this episode. I really appreciate it. And if you're interested, you can find me on the Substack as the Venus Diaries. Thanks, guys.
All right, Katriena, thank you so much for that submission. You're always bringing a ton of information to the table. I love it. And the first thing I want to say here has to do with the Pleiades, because the Pleiades is such an interesting cluster of stars. And I've done at least one presentation, full presentation on it, but I mention it kind of frequently. And there is a very intriguing thing that I like to mention regarding the fact that I think a lot of symbolism associated with the Pleiades at one point in time was associated with another constellation, which would be Ursa Major, and this would be the Big Dipper or another asterism. But what's intriguing about this is that Ursa Major was once referred to as the thigh of a bull. And so this was during more primordial times, and then it seems as though humanity became more solar. And so a lot of the symbolism, like associating the northern sky with being a gateway to heaven, was actually transferred to a cluster of stars on the ecliptic, the path of the sun. And it seems as though the Pleiades was the best option to basically mirror some of this earlier symbolism. So you'll find that a lot of people, when they talk about the Pleiades, they talk about this being sort of a gateway to the afterlife. In fact, the axis between Taurus and Scorpio really represents this very well. And so with Taurus, you have Aldebaran, a royal star. With Scorpio, you have Antares, another royal star. And these two gates, as Katriena mentioned, have been referred to as the Golden Gate and the Silver Gate. When you're looking at Taurus, you are looking away from the galactic center. When you're looking towards Scorpio, you're looking towards it. So it seems as though this makes a lot of sense that people would see sort of this gateway dynamic there.
To piggyback off this, I have another quote that I think will add to the conversation. In addition to Aldebaran, Taurus contains the Pleiades, or Seven Sisters, which had profound meanings in the ancient religion of Venus, Aphrodite, as the goddess of wisdom, whose pearly gates they tended and whose 7 pillars represented them in the temple. Now that's from Barbara Walker, Women's Dictionary of Symbols and Sacred Objects.
There you go. Yeah. You know, Ursa Major obviously has 7 stars, 7 main stars. I've probably said this before, but I'm inclined to think that we literally get the glyph, the symbol for the number 7, from the Big Dipper, because it looks like a 7.
Right.
And it's interesting. There is lore about the Pleiades having a missing 7th sister. And so I believe her name was Electra.
Ah.
And so here's another kind of angle with all of this. Their father was Atlas. And so Atlas is known for holding up the world. That's more of the modern version of Atlas. The older version of Atlas is that he's holding up the vault of heaven. He's holding up the night sky. And this puts him in place with the North Pole, that he is the pole that holds up the firmament, essentially, if you want to put it that way, which is intriguing because she was saying that the Hebrew letter Vav, which corresponds with the Hierophant card, can also mean tent pole, right? And so the tent pole symbolism has a lot to do with the world axis, in my opinion. There's different groups that actually have rituals based around a central tent pole, and they're going around it. So they're doing a circumambulation ritual. To me, all circumambulation rituals are essentially mirroring the stars going around a central star, going around the North Star. Now, what's interesting about this as well is that Vav, another correspondence, is that it means nail. And so again, this is the Hebrew letter that corresponds with the Hierophant card. So why nail? How does nail make sense? It makes sense when you consider that it's the 5th card of the major arcana, and therefore it has a relationship with the 5th element, which would be spirit ether, and spirit/ether binds everything the same way the nail binds pieces of wood together. But also, Polaris has been referred to as the nail star. And so the nail, in and of itself, is just a little world axis mundi symbol.
Well, this harkens back to what you mentioned in the beginning of the show with the number 4 and the firmament being held up by 4 posts.
Right. Yep. 4 posts. It can be 4 elephants. You'll see a representation of this in the chariot card. You'll see that the charioteer is surrounded by 4 posts. Those 4 posts or poles, they hold up the night sky, essentially. So he, therefore, is representing the 5th post or the 5th pole. Those 4 poles could represent the 4 elements. That means that he represents the 5th element. So yeah, the number 5 as it relates to the Hierophant card is pretty mind-blowing, actually. There's so much going on there. So I'll just say as well, it's the 5th card of the major arcana. We're dealing with Roman numeral 5, which looks like a V. Interesting that Taurus rules this card, and Taurus is ruled by Venus. Also interesting, as Katriena mentioned, that Venus, over the course of 8 years, makes this 5-petaled rose. And also, as it relates to the V, Roman numeral 5, that is the most prominent feature in the Taurus constellation, is that large V. So the V symbolism and the 5 symbolism, it really truly is completely off the charts. And so I've done presentations about this, but it's definitely worth knowing or worth looking into if you're unfamiliar with all these different connections.
Thank you, Katriena. Sweet, sweet Katriena. You're always bringing it, and I love your angle because it always sparks so many thoughts in my mind, and it's because you always go back to the ancient feminine energies of a lot of these signs, which is so abundant here with Venus and Taurus. Now, I wanted to talk about the 5-petaled rose and also just the 5-petaled nature of other flowers. So again, I have another quote, and it is from Barbara Walker yet again. And she says, like the 5-petaled apple blossom and the 5-lobed apple, the rose formed a natural pentacle. Like the apple and its pentacle, the rose was sacred to the goddess everywhere. She also goes on to talk about the rosary and says, just as the rosary or rose wreath was adopted from the Middle East for application to the Christian version of the Virgin Goddess, so the rose also was declared proper to the worship of Mary, despite its earlier blatantly sexual symbolism. Now, you've talked a lot about Mary. We've talked a lot about Mary over the years and the deep-seated goddess symbolism within her and what she represents. Now, the connection to Mary and the rose goes pretty deep. And I think that there's such a strong Venusian quality to this, not only because of the 5 petals, but because of the scent that the rose has. And like Katriena mentioned, Venus is related to scents and perfumeries. And I love that aspect of Venus. And I just love that thought of flowers and the scents that they carry. I wouldn't call myself an aromatherapist by any means, but I do have quite a good nose. And I find that scent is such an important part of our connection to the world, to our emotions, and to how we operate in the world. Because Like most people know, if you have a familiar scent that comes to you, the memories that come from that scent are off the charts. And they could be good memories, they could be bad memories, they can be neutral memories. But I think what's important is to realize the power of scent and why it's such an important sense of ours.
Right, right. And they say we have 5 senses. At least that's the common sort of thing. I think we actually have more, but that's a topic for another time. One of the things that this reminds me of, there is symbolism associating the bull with being at the center of the wheel, the hub of the wheel, the axis of the wheel. When I refer to pole symbolism, oftentimes, or perhaps all the time, it's related to that exact same center, right? And it's interesting, our face actually has a center to it, and it's the most protruding part of our face, which would be our nose. Our nose sticks out further than anything else on our face, right? If you look sideways. And it's really interesting, actually. When you look at the Aztec sunstone, everything emanates from the center. And so the center of the sunstone is the most potent part of the whole entire design. The same way the center of any system is the transcendental part of the system. And when you look at the very center of the middle circle, there contains a small man. There's a face inside that circle. And dead center in the middle of that circle, so dead center in the whole entire Aztec sunstone, is his nose. And to me, that's very, very deliberate because the nose is kind of the central mountain on our face.
Right.
Or it's the central pole. It's the central axis on our face. So there is a significance there that is really, really powerful. And if I'm not mistaken, scent, it really has more of a spiritual quality to it than some of the other senses.
Yes.
And so does sound, and having the ability to hear things. These are considered to be more subtle and more elevated, I would say, in some ways.
And I have a couple more thoughts on this connection to scent and the connection of perfumeries to Venus because of the way that we would distill an essential oil or a hydrosol, or basically just the process of distilling a plant, was typically and still is today done in a copper still. And that to me has always been such a profound connection with Venus. And I do have another quote that goes along with this from Barbara Walker. And she says, "The symbol of Venus meant copper in alchemy because copper was sacred to the goddess ever since her major shrine was located on Cyprus, the Isle of Copper." Right there, it's just, you can't deny these connections. And it's so deeply satisfying to me to see all those connections come together like they do. This also brings me to something else that Katriena talked about, which was quintessence. And speaking of alchemy, I was going through Robert Bartlett's book, which is entitled Real Alchemy. And what he writes about this is, "The quintessence is the most purified and fixed part of a matter, formed by the perfect balance of the 4 elements. This harmony between opposing forces of the elements brings forth a whole new and exalted state, the 5th element, or quintessence." Now, this reminds me of a couple things. One is what you talked about in your Kingdoms, Kings, and Crosses presentation, which was the wheel and the cross, and that center of the wheel with the cross in it is the quintessence. That is what we're trying to get to. And he's basically illustrating that here in that quote. And also just basically that the quintessence is also, in my opinion, kind of like, it's like the divine spark. It's related to fire and the universal central fire, which is continuously always burning within us and without us, in my opinion.
Yeah. And, one thing to say about that too, regarding the 5, like the 5th element, ether, is it the 5th or is it the 1st? And so that's just something to consider, is that it's actually the 1st. We refer to it as the 5th, but the other elements actually come out of that. It's actually more primordial than the other 4 elements. And so the quintessence as well, in some ways, what it represents is prima materia. And so it's like the first thing to exist. So everything is kind of an emanation of it. Versus it being something that's generated or created from all these things coming together. It's kind of flipped in some ways.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Well, speaking of the quintessence and the 5th element and the number 5, you brought up the apple. And if you cut the apple sideways, horizontally, you will reveal that 5-pointed star. And in fact, there's some philosophers that would have their students cut an apple and say that now you can learn the mysteries of the universe. Just study this is basically what it's saying. What's interesting about that is if you cut the apple vertically, but you actually reveal the toroidal nature of the apple as well. Mm-hmm. It's pinched up top and it's pinched down below. So basically, it's a torus field. So it really is like a very appropriate fruit to bring up with everything that we're talking about today.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, one of the things that I wrote down when I was doing research in preparation for today was some thoughts and quotes from a book I have called Froha's Apples by Sarah Bonaday George. And shout out to our good friend Edie. She introduced me to this book. And this book is a collection of Swedish folklore surrounding plants. It's all about Froha's apples, though. And Froha is also connected to Freya and Frigg and all those same goddesses, in my opinion, where there is that through line of the same connection. And on this subject, Sarah writes, over time, different goddesses have been linked to the apple tree in Northern Europe. In pre-Christian times, the goddess Idun has her apples, fruit that gave the Old Norse gods their youth. Then later, we see Froha associated with fruit trees, a powerful goddess who in Old Norse record is associated with magic, war, and fertility. And one of the coolest things about this book is the folklore surrounding Froha is that at the end of the apple harvest, you're to leave some apples on the tree for Froha. And this is going to basically dictate whether you have a good harvest next year. It's just so nice to think about Froha coming through the apple orchards to be able to have apples during the winter when there's no other fruit around. So if you're at all interested in these sorts of folkloric northern traditions, I highly recommend checking out that book because I could go on about it, but I'm not going to.
Well, you know what's really interesting about that? I would not be surprised. I don't know much about the apple tree, but there could be another reason why you would want to leave some of the apples behind. And that actually what you'll find is that some folklore traditions and some of the rituals and things like that that come along with it have very practical reasons for being there. But the way that the tradition was passed down, hey, this tree does well when you do this. Hey, this crop does well when you do that. They actually pass it down through folklore, and so there could be a reason behind the type of apples that they were growing or whatever their setup was, the climate or whatnot. There could be another very, very practical sort of reason for that.
Right. I would agree. And a lot of times these folkloric stories get passed down and then there's a lot of like magical things connected to it when it is exactly what you're saying. It's more of a practicality thing. And the first thing that comes to me is if you were to leave apples on the tree, you're going to have seeds for next year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. It could be something like that. Well, as with most Katriena voicemails, we could go on and on and on. There's a lot to chew on, lots of different angles. And I just want to say the last thing that I think is interesting, she mentioned something about the Pleiades, I believe, being referred to as rain bringers or the rainy ones.
Yes, she did.
And when I was prepping for this episode, one of my books that I have was talking about the symbolic connection that some cultures had with the cow being related to a container or a vessel. And it makes sense with the udder. You look at the udder and you look at this just big mass that holds milk, and it makes sense that they would associate container symbolism with that, of course, but then also just the mass and size of a cow in general, right? As we've been talking about today. And so some of the lore that I was reading about associates the cow with also being essentially a cloud, that the cow is a cloud and they contain the water that's going to eventually break open and rain upon the earth. And so it's really interesting to think of sort of the cow as the cloud and then also the cow as like the earth itself. And so I thought that was really, really interesting. I don't know if I've ever heard that before.
I have not, but what it makes me think of is April showers bring May flowers.
There you go. So anyways, just throwing that out there for what it's worth.
Hello, my name is Noah Campbell of Facing North Astrology. When I was asked by the fine people of Symbolic Studies to contribute some thoughts towards Taurus, little did they know the pedigree to which I could speak on this topic. For my maternal grandmother and paternal grandfather were both born upon the same date within the sign of the bull. My mother has a Taurus moon. My son's mother has a Taurus moon. My uncle was born upon the same date as my maternal grandmother and paternal grandfather. And my son has a Taurus sun, Venus, and moon. Families often have certain astrological signatures which work through the generations and define a specific lineage. Taurus seems to be a specifically powerful, resonant feature for my family. I myself have Mars and my midheaven within Taurus, and my sun is directly upon the red eye of the bull, Aldebaran, which we will get back to in a minute. Now, there's a function of astrology, which is the meaningful usage of the symbology of the stars, where the principles of the darkness and the light, of the active and the passive, the masculine and the feminine, always come with a mixture and a balance. Within the structure of dignity within astrology, Taurus would seem to be the most feminine of all signs. It is, in fact, a yin sign, all earth signs being feminine, ruled by Venus, a decidedly feminine planet, and the moon, the most feminine, motherly goddess of all the planets, exalts within the sign of Taurus. And yet, the sign is portrayed by a bull, not a cow, but the masculine version. This is a seemingly odd choice for the symbology of a sign where the two most universally accepted feminine lights in the sky have their greatest dignity. And yet the time which Taurus takes place within is a decidedly young period of our solar cycle. There's more light than night, and the light is growing every day in the spring. Now the bull itself, while being masculine, tends towards the yin. For the vast majority of time, if you observe a bull, it is lackadaisically lolling around, munching upon grass. Taurus, being an earth sign, is based on the practical, that which is undecidedly useful and rational. And so the bull spends all its time eating grass until there's a need and a reason to rise up and access the red star, which is the alpha of Taurus, Aldebaran. Now, within this sign, which is generally considered to be profoundly Venusian, calm, relaxing, concerned with pleasure, we have a star that is decidedly martial. In fact, Aldebaran is one of the 4 royal Persian stars, considered to have profound powers of protection. Specifically, Aldebaran has been correlated to the archangel Michael, who is a warrior and defender. Now, what's interesting to think about with all this is that Venus rules 2 signs in the zodiac, Taurus and Libra. Both of them are opposed to the signs of Scorpio and Aries, the signs that Mars rules. Mars and Venus are opposites within the zodiacal scheme. And yet within the core of Taurus, we have a red martial star. When I think of that, I think of the symbol which is known in Western society as the yin-yang, but is called the Tai Chi, where the red eye of Mars is contained within the overwhelming peace of the bull. Of course, Taurus is a fixed sign and earth. And so the Mars of anyone influenced by the sign of Taurus is rarely seen, but when accessed, is furious and unstoppable. Because when Venus doesn't get what she wants, and when the moon is threatened, the bull will rear his horns. Looking at the connection between Taurus and Libra becomes very interesting. If we correlate the light cycle of the year to the day, spring is the morning, whereas the fall is the evening. Now, there are systems where Venus is not viewed purely as a planet of peace and beauty. In fact, in China, the morning star Venus is a god of war, while the evening star of Venus carries her more luxurious and beautiful significations. And so the spring sign of the bull has within it the threat of violence, the threat of the horns, while the fall sign, Libra, rests with the more peaceful and socially pleasant significations of Venus. It's worth considering as well that the metal which specifically correlates to Venus is copper. Now, via the Pythagorean color scheme, which matches the color wheel to the zodiac, think primary colors of the fire signs. We all know red is Aries, yellow is Leo. The secondary colors go to the air signs, so Libra becomes green. You can map the whole color wheel, and the feminine signs of the tertiary colors. Taurus, near the beginning of the zodiac, where everything is fresh and new, is given the color vermilion, which is not entirely unlike the color of copper. There's a relationship there. It's not quite exact, but it's somewhat similar. Now, as copper ages and it oxidizes, it turns green, which is the color of Libra. Libra coming after the sun has fallen, as light and life itself begins to decay. But in the beginning of that decay, we have beauty. Now, what truly fascinates me is that this green coloration of copper comes on because of the process of oxidation, and Libra is an air sign. More interestingly, the glyph of Libra very much approximates the symbol we now use to designate oxidizing material as a hazard. And despite how we need oxygen to live, the very process of oxidation ages us and eventually kills us. Some of the mythological lore of Taurus can be traced all the way back to Egypt, to much of what the lore of the constellations are, which has to do with their heliacal rising and eventually falling from grace and from our ability to see them. Osiris was viewed as Orion within the sky, and his heliacal rising once heralded the vernal equinox. As precession proceeded and he no longer rose during the vernal equinox, around 4500 BC, the mythology of the death of Osiris took hold and the birth of Horus was required. And Taurus was correlated to Horus. The constellation of Taurus was seen as a divine falcon. Interestingly enough, from other sources, we see that Osiris was correlated to Taurus, but we also know that Horus was viewed as the resurrection of Osiris. And Horus is the divine union of the masculine and feminine, of Isis and Osiris, which we see within all the significations and the totality of the sign of Taurus. The glyph of Taurus, while clearly seen as the head of a bull with horns, is also the crescent moon reflecting the light of the sun. And you can see that very clearly in the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot card of the High Priestess. The Phoenicians viewed the word El as bull, which became, within other languages through time, El grew to mean God, which is an interesting connection between the tarot card, the hierophant, which is correlated to the sign of Taurus. Taurus, of course, contains one of the most celebrated asterisms in the sky, which is the Pleiades, which is a wormhole into itself, which is too much to get into within the context of this podcast. But they are often depicted as birds sitting on the shoulder of a bull, which once again combines these significations of martial powers being used to protect the yin, the calmness of the bull being a place that birds can land upon. Living upon Cree territory, I like to look towards their star lore, and their view of the Pleiades was that it was the hole in the sky where spirits first entered our realm and incarnated as human beings. And with them, part of the rules for this woman to enter our reality was she had to take a gift to remind her where she came from. And the gift she had was an 8-pointed star blanket to remind her where she came from. And I find that interesting in terms of the significations of Taurus, of comfort, that it's a blanket, to know that as we incarnate as humans in this body, we are actually stardust, and our realm is the spirit realm, which we will all return to after our incarnation here. And if there's any sign that loves being incarnated as a human, it is the sign of Taurus. And the most profound evidence I have of that is that my grandmother, born into the sign of Taurus, is about to turn 102 years old. And when I asked her what she wants for her birthday, she said it's to keep living. Yeah, apparently this is a great place to be. Peace and love. Thank you.
Okay, Noah, thank you so much for that contribution. That was excellent. I really enjoyed that. And happy early birthday to your grandmother, 102. That's wild. So there's a few things you mentioned that I'd never heard before that I find to be pretty interesting. The first one that comes to mind is you mentioned that Venus as the morning and evening star have different connotations in China. And you were saying that the morning star would be indicative of war. That makes sense. I've noticed that this is a pattern as well. The morning time is definitely more active, right? And so in a way, there's almost kind of this cardinal sort of energy, things taking off. Kind of reminds me a little bit of Aries as well, right? This very active, hot, fiery sign that kicks off the zodiac. And then you mentioned that the evening star would be related to beauty. And that makes perfect sense to me. And then, of course, to just the beauty of the night sky and the feminine having this long, deep, ancient, historic relationship with darkness and with the stars and things like that. So that makes a ton of sense. I really loved what you had to say regarding copper turning green as well. I hadn't considered that symbolically. I obviously know that's true, but that is really, really intriguing and pretty profound. And in case I haven't mentioned it recently, just something to consider that I think is really potent symbolically is that women have more copper in their blood, whereas men have more iron in their blood. And so iron being related to Mars, copper once again being related to Venus. And isn't it interesting as well that Aries relates to Mars, which relates to iron, Taurus relates to copper and Venus, and so they're right next to each other. So there's almost this pairing going on. In fact, the more esoteric connection actually with the true consort of Venus isn't Mars. That's the more common sort of way of looking at it, that men are from Mars, women are from Venus. My understanding is that that's kind of a relatively modern sort of interpretation of things. But the esoteric interpretation is that Venus's true partner is Mercury. So you could say women symbolically are from Venus and men symbolically are from Mercury. What I think is kind of curious about that is that Venus corresponds with Taurus. So the exoteric relationship has to do with Mars. What's kind of curious about all of this is that we have a sign in Taurus relating to Venus, and just before Taurus was Aries, indicative of Mars, and then right after Taurus is Gemini, indicative of Mercury. So whether you're looking at her partner in Mars or her partner in Gemini or her partner in Mercury, she's right in between both of them.
Right.
So perhaps this is a lover's triangle of sorts.
Oh, yes. Yeah, thank you, Noah. And I, too, was really intrigued by you bringing up the copper turning green. And it was one of those things where a light went off when you said it, and I instantly was like, I want to look more into oxidation, right? You know, what's actually happening. And what's taking place during oxidation is something called a patina is being formed around the copper. And the word patina has Italian roots, and it means dish or pan. And it also in Latin means a shallow dish. And some people, when I was looking things up, kind of think that maybe that the association with the patina and the dish is that there may have been shallow copper dishes, or they were using copper pans. And so then they associated that with the green color and called it patina. And essentially what the patina is doing is it's protecting the copper so that oxidation does not continue to happen, which then makes me think about the protective nature of a mother, and then the divine mother goddess of Venus. And then what it also makes me think of is just the green color of the heart chakra and that association with Taurus and Venus.
Wow. Well, you know what this is making me think of? You're bringing up oxygen, oxidation, and we have the ox.
Oh, yes. Perfect.
And the ox is basically a castrated bull.
Yes.
And so ox symbolism is completely in play with Taurus. And in fact, it's kind of the Western esoteric tradition a lot of times to not refer to the bull or the cow, but actually to refer to the ox. And I just have to say as well, the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet is Aleph, which means ox. And in fact, the letter itself looks like a plow.
Interesting.
And just to say, Ursa Major, which, just to remind you, in ancient Egypt was looked at as the thigh of the bull, or sometimes the thigh of Set, has been viewed for a long time as a plow. And so it's a plow constellation. In fact, there are flags, like there's one in Ireland called the Starry Plow. And it's a simple depiction of a plow, but it has the 7 stars of Ursa Major laid on top of it. So the ox is something that's referenced a lot, like in tarot. If you're reading books on the tarot, the ox comes up. And Aleph corresponds with the first card in the major arcana. It's the full card. And so just to kind of highlight once again how fundamental and how primordial cow symbolism is. So I would say that one distinction with the ox versus the cow and versus the bull is that there is a heavy implication of agrarian symbolism. So basically farming symbolism, the farming lifestyle and things like that, because it's a draft animal. It's being put to work, essentially. That's what they're good for.
Right. Well, I mean, if I can, I want to go into a couple thoughts that I've had in preparation for today, which is on the runes Urus, which is ox, but also Fehu, which is cattle. And Fehu is the first rune of the Elder Futhark, and Urus is the second rune of the Elder Futhark. So again, there's that connection of the pair working together. And now Fehu is a rune of cattle, but it's also a rune of wealth, but in particular, movable wealth. And anyone who's looked into the history of currency and things like that, we know that cattle and livestock was used as a form of currency or a form of trade. So that was the movable wealth of Fehu. It was the beginning. It's the first one. And then we go to Uruz, which is the ox. He is also the creation of, in my opinion, from Fehu, because Fehu has a female polarity while Uruz has the male polarity. And from the book Northern Mysteries and Magic by Freya Aswin, she says, Fehu and Uruz are closely interlinked, both relating to cattle. They are a pair and operate together in a process of creating and sustaining the life forms on this plane. So again, going back to that primordial cow, the 4 rivers of milk that nourished the beings of this plane, and being connected to these 2 runes, I just had to bring it up because it's just such a beautiful connection to me. And the fact that Fehu is first and then Uruz comes second, going back to the great goddess of creation, her creating the ox that is known as Uruz, or the plow.
Interesting. And I just have to point out, one of my favorite combinations of letters is UR. So Ursa, there's a lot of words that have this sort of dynamic, but Uruz. And what I've looked into with the UR words is that a lot of times it does represent the first. It represents this primordial sort of primal kind of essence in a way. So to me, that makes sense with Uruz.
Yes, and just to confirm that, Freya talks about Uruz is the will to live, the primal impulse to be and to become. In German and Dutch, means primal or ancient.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, exactly. Hey there, it's Mario once again. Did you know I'm a lifelong artist and graphic designer? In fact, that is my bread and butter. I've been a graphic designer for nearly 3 decades and have designed just about everything imaginable, whether it be logos, book covers, websites, you name it. If you're looking for a creative who is symbolically literate, look no further. You can check out my portfolio at symbolicstudies.com. And of course, if you have any questions, get in touch. Okay, back to the episode. So the last thing I'll say here about Noah's voicemail is he mentioned the crescent moon on top of the circle, and that being obviously the horns of the glyph for Taurus. And just to say, it's so interesting that lunar symbolism has a huge weave / association with Taurus. Mm-hmm. One of the things I'll mention is just a lot of the lore associated with the moon. You know, it's related to silver, and silver has a lot of interesting properties to it. Silver is the metal associated with the moon. But we have these stories, or we have folklore like the cow that jumped over the moon, right? Little stories or fairy tales or whatever. Of all the animals, it's the cow that jumps over the moon. Mm-hmm. Also, the idea that the moon was made out of cheese.
Right.
So this has to do with milk. And there's several others, actually. You know, you can just kind of unpack it from there. But I just wanted to mention that for what it's worth.
Hi, Mario. Hi, Michelle. This is Emily Ridout at the International School of Astro Yoga, calling in to talk to you about Taurus energy. So Taurus has so much goddess encoded energy. Primordially, Taurus is the first woman and Aries is the first man. We also have symbolism in the word Taurus, Taurus, Tau being a cross or a letter T, and Rus, the color red, for the rosy cross, which is, of course, a symbol used typically in sort of Christian goddess culture. So we have Taurus, which is the bull, also emblematic of the goddess Hathor. And rightly so, this sign is ruled by Venus, and it has the moon in exaltation. And when we have traditional astrology schools, particularly the Greek school, they are the two feminine encoded, visible with the naked eye aspects of astrology in the planetary bodies. So we have Venus, who rules over our desire nature. So Venus is the planet that grants you what you want to have. Typically, she rules over love, beauty, and money, because a lot of what people want are, abundance in some form, beauty to surround them, and love and connection in their lives. And then the moon is in exaltation here. The moon is the planet that waxes and wanes and helps us to move through these cycles and seasons of life. And in Taurus season, it's always a very rich season, particularly in the northern hemisphere, because we have the plants and the flowers blooming and all of these beautiful natural moments. Now, in Astro Yoga, Taurus rules the neck in particular, and it's connected to the heart chakra. And this is highly connected with the tarot cards associated with Taurus, which I'll get into in just a second. But in the neck area, we have everything that is vital for life, right? Just like the primordial first woman mythologically has birthed all of humanity, the neck holds the space for all of the life-giving activities to occur. So the breath moves through the neck, the blood, the lymph, all these channels that keep you alive connect head to the rest of the body. And the neck holds what's known as the inner ear. So there are glands and nerve endings in the neck which help us to process our inner voice. Now, some people hear this as an actual auditory voice on the inner plane, And some people have more of a sense, an inner knowing that comes from their inner voice. It happens different ways in different people, but we're told that the neck is the seat of where we hear the voice of the heart, the inner wisdom. And so when we're looking at Taurus energy, we're looking at everything connected with the neck, the inner ear, the lower brain stem that sends these impulses to the body, and all of these life-giving channels. And then we look at the tarot card associated with Taurus, and we have the hierophant. I love the hierophant. In some older decks, it's called the Pope because often it looks like a Pope figure wearing the sort of Piscean hat that he wears of the different tiers symbolizing the different elements in the zodiac. We have two choristers bowing and kneeling before him, typically one cloaked in roses and one cloaked in lilies. And they have these suspenders on often, which show the yoking action, because this card, and I'm getting ahead of myself here, but I just get so excited about this fact that this card has so much to do with our concept of yoking that we have in yoga, which of course, yoke is sort of the root word there in yoga, yuj, which means to yoke. And so I'll get into that a little more in just a second because I do think it's very interesting. But first I want to hit on the hierophant. So the hierophant, sometimes called the Pope, is called the hierophant. Hierophant literally means the speaker of higher truths. And so the hierophant represents the voice that comes from within, the voice of the higher self that utters actual true wisdom. And then the choristers represent our desire nature with the roses and our knowledge, what we know or think we know, with the lilies. And so they bow down before the hierophant because the inner voice of knowing knows better than our piecemeal or, sort of circumstantial desires and knowledge that we hold as limited beings. And so the hierophant is the card that represents the speaking of higher truth. You'll see he often has something around his neck. The neck is highly highlighted in this card. But also the letter associated with this card, Vav, means to nail. And it has a very similar meaning to the idea of to yoke. What are we doing? We're binding something together, right? And what we are binding is our sort of lower embodied personality level self with the higher self, which seeks to express through the personality, through the body, through the life that we are presently living. And so the hierophant, this Taurus energy, this Taurus, right? This energy that comes through the body to express in physical reality really is this beautiful energy of what it means to have harmony and beauty. So there's that Venusian quality in the earth plane. And Taurus, of course, with Hathor, with the Rosy Cross, with the idea of Mother Earth, and we even have Earth Day embedded in this season, is the energy of sort of the goddess of Mother Earth. And so that's the hierophant. And then Venus, who is the ruler of this sign, is connected with the Empress. And the Empress shows us what it means when we use Venusian energy properly, where we love and nurture things into blossoming and growing, and where we select the right seeds to plant in our lives. And there's very much in this sign a informative energy about choosing and selecting your desire wisely. So we listen to the inner voice to select our right desire, or if we've, as we all do, select a foolhardy desire or a desire that doesn't feel aligned in some way that isn't aligned with our higher truth, we wait, we listen, we gain the wisdom and knowledge that we need, and then we choose a higher desire next time. Now, this doesn't mean you have to artificially choose what you believe to be a high desire, but it does mean that as we move toward what we desire, we learn things, and sometimes we think we desire something, and I think a lot of people experience this. They get sort of a hit from their inner voice saying, wait a second, not that, this, right? How often has that happened to so many people? You're on one path and then you hear from within, maybe a different way, maybe something more aligned with your heart. And so that's in a gist what this sign is about. And I would love to just keep going forever and talk about the Empress and how she is actually the doorway through which manifestation occurs, and what it means to selectively manifest life, selectively manifest what your life will hold, selectively manifest these things. I could talk for maybe like 2 hours on this sign, but I'm going to cut it short there because I know that you're going to probably cover so much of that. And the main takeaway for this one is it's the voice of the inner ear, and it's the understanding of Earth itself, Mother Earth itself, and our bodies themselves. So our understanding that we can manifest what the higher self wants to manifest and be embodied channels for that. Okay, thanks so much, and I hope you are both having just a wonderful start to your spring.
Okay, Emily, thank you so much for that voicemail there. We love hearing your insights about all of the signs. We get so much out of it. It's always lovely, beautiful stuff, and this was no different. Everything you had to say regarding the neck and how it relates to the inner ear, the voice of the heart, inner wisdom, and things like that. Really, really profound stuff. And I just want to say that, you know, our higher wisdom is our inner wisdom. And there's such a profound relationship there. Related to that, I'm glad you brought up the small detail with the hierophant card. A lot of times their neck is emphasized and there is a covering sometimes over their neck or something along these lines. And related to that actually is this idea of yoke being related to yoga. And I immediately thought of the yoke that we put on animals like the cow, like the ox or bull, so that they can pull a cart, or so that they can pull a plow, or so that they can be hooked up with another animal and together they can pull these things. And so what is pretty fascinating about that is the yoke is obviously around the neck, and we're talking about neck symbolism. Some people have said that the yoke is actually the inspiration for the Libra glyph. And so if you turn a yoke upside down, it essentially looks like a very simplified version of that symbol. And wouldn't you know it, Libra is also ruled by Venus. So it kind of comes around full circle in a way. But I had to mention that. I also have to mention the fact that you brought up Hathor, and you're probably well aware of this, but the goddess expression of Hathor, she has large ears. And so again, this inner voice sort of dynamic and sound and inner ear and all of that stuff. I had to bring that up as well.
Yes, great points. Thank you, Emily. And as always, as Mario said, bringing it, and we're loving it. I, too, was really into the inner ear connection that Emily mentioned, specifically the neck being the seat of the voice of the heart. And this connection to Taurus and Venus is so very strong. And the other thing that is connected to ear is that the word ear is in earth.
Yeah.
So we have EARTH. And so that connection as well. And as we were talking about earlier with senses and our sense of smell, you know, we have a sense of hearing as well. And that's a very important one too. And that being so connected with this sign is really interesting as well. Whenever I hear anything about the ears, my ears personally perk up quite a bit, especially because the ears are a part of my body that I have to pay attention to, and I tend to pay attention to because I typically feel a lot of things through my ears, whether that be sensations or when there's changes in the weather or in myself or the environment around me. It typically comes to me through my ears, which is really interesting. So it's just something as I grow older that I know that I have to keep my arsenal stocked with ear remedies, because it's something that is going on actually currently right now, which I think is funny because we're in Taurus, just something I'm having to nurse right now. And the other connection to the ears that I always look to is what comes through German New Medicine. And that is when we have something going on with our ears, depending on the side of the body that it's happening on, it could be related to that you heard something that you didn't want to hear, or that you heard something that was difficult for you to hear or to process. And while you're healing that conflict that may have come up with the thing that you maybe didn't hear, or it was hard for you to process, you're going to maybe experience pain. You might experience fullness in the ear. You might experience inflammation. And that is actually a good sign. And one of the things that I do have to say is that I think that it actually could be something that you heard outside of yourself from someone else, but it could also be your inner voice that you're hearing, that you're not liking that. But I think that there is room to include the thoughts and the actions that we do and we say and we have that could also manifest in these healings or these conflicts that come through in our body.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. With all of your ear issues, I want to make a joke about you not being a good listener. But that's actually not true.
Oh, well, thank you.
So I won't
that.
go there.
I do try. I will say, though, one of the other things that comes to mind with this, the inner voice and the voice of the heart, truth comes up. And that also relates to the hierophant, I think, and him having a covered neck. He holds secrets that are ancient.
Yes.
They're esoteric. They're secrets for a reason. And one of my bigger lessons in life that I continuously have to integrate and learn is that sometimes the truth that you know or the truth that you see is just for you. And it's sometimes better left unsaid, especially when it's going to be communicated to someone that's close to you that you might care about, that they might not be ready to hear the truth that you're observing, that you might see happening in their life. They might not be ready for it. And sometimes it's better left unsaid and left to be marinated for maybe perhaps down the road for them to discover on their own, instead of you trying to be that beacon of light for them. And then it ends up being too much and they weren't ready, and it can actually cause more problems than not. And so I think that there's something to be said about those esoteric truths or those inner truths that we know that are better sometimes for us to hold for the right time.
Exactly. The hierophant, he's a keeper of the mysteries. He is the sort of custodian of sacred knowledge, esoteric knowledge. And he's also the keeper of the keys. So you'll see that on the hierophant card, right? There's always the 2 crossed keys, 1 gold, 1 silver. So just be the keeper of the keys.
Right.
You don't need to give the key to everybody. You don't need to let everybody through. You don't need to open the gates for all. And that actually relates to a lot of things that I've been reading about recently about sacred knowledge, being protected, being private, and just kind of keeping it close to your chest, as you're saying.
Right. And lastly, on this weave of truth or keeping the keys, keeping it to yourself, what comes to mind is a plant that I do associate with Taurus, and that is blooming right now and has been in bloom for a while, which is a plant called honesty. And it's also known as the money plant, and it has these beautiful purple flowers and a starkly heart-shaped leaf. The heart-shaped leaves are very defined on these plants, and I do relate it actually to the hierophant and to a lot of these things we're talking about. And the moon connection with this plant being the money plant. Once this plant goes to seed, it creates these circular silver see-through discs, and in the center of that disc is a seed. And you will see these dried seed pods that are still connected to the stems in a lot of dried floral arrangements and stuff. They're quite famous. But anyway, that kind of weaves in again with this whole honesty weave with Venus and the heart and things like that.
And also just have to say, heart is an anagram of earth.
Yes.
Earth is an anagram of heart. And if there is a color associated with earth, arguably it would be green, and then our heart chakra is green as well.
Right.
So here we are talking about a fixed earth sign, very, very earthy sign. And so there's all sorts of connections there.
And money here in the States is green. And then also there is such an abundance energy coming with Venus and coming with this time of year. And what's on full effect? What's on full display? The greenery of nature that's just really coming to life.
Yeah, exactly right.
Taurus is the Eve of the horoscope, the first woman of the zodiacal wheel, ruled by the planet Venus, the exaltation of the moon. If we look at the glyph for Taurus, it is a crescent moon that we can clearly see. The gods that cluster around this sign are predominantly, unsurprisingly, women, with some notable exceptions. We can, of course, discuss the Greek Poseidonos, Poseidon, who is associated with bulls. We can talk about the lame and ugly blacksmith god Hephaestus, who is married to Aphrodite. But the figures that we can really examine, if we're looking at from Sumer all the way through Rome, they're goddesses of erotic love. It's really just the same goddess manifest in different forms. There are subtle differences between all of them. A unifying feature for all of the aforementioned, though, that we can just toss out now, is that they're all curiously associated with water or with the sea. There's an aquatic image with each of these figures, even with Hephaestus, who is said to be a god of volcanoes, and he's a god of fire, but he is raised by sea goddesses. So that's something that we can ponder as to what the sea, or what does water, long associated with fertility, has to do with Taurus. The Sumerian Inanna, the oldest figure in this list, she is the entire fertility of Sumer is said to be dependent upon her conjugal satisfaction with her beloved shepherd Dumuzi. She is associated with apples, a fruit that is particularly appointed for the goddess Aphrodite. But she's associated with apples, she's associated with lettuce, she's associated with grains and with plants of all kinds and crops. These are all said to pour forth from her womb in her delightfully sensuous and extremely frank poetry that elucidates her relationship with Dumuzi. He's like a young reflection of herself. And that's something that's really pivotal when we examine these goddesses and the men that they choose to be their significant others. They always seem to, sometimes very obviously, sometimes not so, to really be a clear mirror of the goddess herself. This sacred shepherd figure, though, he repeats in pretty much all of these stories, because Dumuzi is no different than Adonis. And these are, and they're always associated with Earth. Ishtar is the Babylonian successor of Inanna, and Ishtar is a little bit more combative, a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more assertive. There's something leonine about her because she rides on the backs of lions, but she propositions the epic hero Gilgamesh, and when he spurns her advances, she sends the bull of heaven to ravage the land in retaliation. The bull is eventually defeated and slaughtered, and Ishtar expresses some regret with her beautiful adornments and her beautiful jewelry, but she is known for her powerfully, rapacious sexuality. And she is not one to take rejection lightly. None of these goddesses, no Venusian figure is known to accept rejection with much grace. Hetheru, Hathor, in Egypt, she is, of course, another bull of heaven. She is extremely venerated, associated with joy and music and beauty. She's imaged on the backs of mirrors, of gatherings where there's festivity, where there's joy. That in particular with music, which is something that is very powerfully associated in the psychology of Taurus. And she is associated with gold, but she, like Ishtar, is known for being a goddess of battle. There's a raging element to Hetheru, to Hathor, but her importance is extremely, extremely vital to the greater oeuvre of gods in Egypt, in Kemet. When we get to the Greek Aphrodite, she seems to be seemingly the apotheosis of this troop of love deities. Sensuous pleasure and aesthetic delight, passion aroused by beauty, erotic love. But she is also markedly independent. She is born of the sea. She is associated with water. She likewise is associated with flowers and with fruit, with apples. She is associated with gold. But she is extremely, extremely, extremely assertive in her own right. Excuse me. There's a willfulness to her and a very sharp, cunning intelligence, which incidentally ties her back to Inanna, who is also said to be a wise counselor and be very judicious. This kind of tips us off a little bit to when we get to Libra, this unification of sharp beauty and sharp intellect. Aphrodite is the patron of the courtesans. They are culture bringers, and she is married to Hephaestus, who now, everything that Aphrodite wears, her magic girdle, her golden jewelry, these are all said to be made by Hephaestus himself. He takes raw substance and transforms it. He refines it, the raw elements of nature. He literally beats it into adornment to honor, to worship of his wife, the great goddess of love. Because like his brother Ares, he serves the feminine. Thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Tom McDonald. You may find me on Instagram, TMackey. 1018, or you can find me at Quora. I am so smitten with doing these, and I look forward to contributing in the future.
All right, Tom, thank you so much for that voicemail. Awesome stuff, as always. We love your insights over here. And you're speaking to a lot of the things that we have mentioned already, right? So the apple symbolism you mentioned with Aphrodite, we got into that. Also the correspondence with music and Taurus, and we're talking about ear symbolism and how that relates to Hathor and everything else. I love some of the insights you mentioned, though, regarding the goddess not taking rejection well. Makes perfect sense for a lot of different reasons.
Oh, yeah.
I like what you said about Aphrodite's consort, Hephaestus, serving the feminine with his craft. Very interesting. And you know what I'll say? You reminded me of something in the tarot that I haven't brought up yet. And it's the fact that the universe card has a sneaky connection to Taurus. So the final card of the major arcana, the universe or the world card, oftentimes, in fact, I think all the time, unless you're talking about newer decks, will show a goddess in the center. And generally there is a wreath that surrounds her. So she is centrally located, and she essentially represents, again, this hub of the wheel dynamic. And in fact, her navel, her belly button, her abdomen is dead center in the card. So in so many ways, I see that she represents what makes the world go around. And we're talking about the world card. She makes the universe go around. The goddess, the feminine, makes the world go around, right? It's from which we all came from woman. Now, you will also see the fixed signs in the corners. You'll see the lion for Leo. You will see a man for Aquarius. And you will see an eagle for Scorpio. And then you will also see the bull for Taurus. What's intriguing is that in the Thoth deck, the bull is the only one that has eyes that are swirly.
Oh, right.
Which is just kind of interesting. So the bull is treated sometimes, depending on the deck, and this is a very esoteric deck, the bull is treated differently than all of the other signs. And I've wondered why that is the case. And I'm not saying that this is exclusively the reason for it, but it's intriguing when you consider that the Hebrew letter that corresponds with that card is Tau or Tav. Tau as in T-A-U. Essentially, this means cross. But when you're talking about Tau, you're essentially talking about a word that relates back to Taurus. So T-A-U, it's right there within Taurus, right? So what I've noticed is that this Tau arguably has a reference to Taurus. And the first card of the major arcana is the Fool. So arguably, you can say that the final card of the major arcana has this hidden symbolism that relates to Taurus in some way, shape, or form through the Hebrew letter and a few other things. Now, this cross dynamic actually makes sense because with the fixed signs, you're creating a fixed cross. And who is at the center of the cross? It would be the goddess. It would be the woman. So she is emblematic, kind of like what I was talking earlier about the bull or the cow being at the center of the wheel of heaven. She, in that card, is the center of the wheel of heaven. And so let's not forget that the full card, the first card of the major arcana, has the Aleph Ox connection. So in some ways, you can say that the major arcana starts with a bull reference with Aleph and Ox and ends with a bull reference with the Tau and Tau cross. So for what it's worth, I wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you, Tom. It's always nice to hear from you. I like what you said about the goddesses not taking rejection well. That's so true. And I think that it's kind of a womanly thing, obviously. And what this makes me think of is kind of that underlying competition that I think that's there between males and females. But I think particularly with females, there are aspects of jealousy and spite and aggression, which can be kind of the negative sides of Taurus when a woman is more beautiful than them, or they have something that they want but they don't have. And what I'm thinking of with this is the Mean Girls. And there's movies about this. There's a movie called Mean Girls and how women will put themselves against each other. And it's always kind of for like these petty reasons. And a lot of times it comes down to like the beauty aspects or like the lack of beauty that someone has or the perceived beauty that somebody has about someone else, but someone else doesn't see that. And there's like this like underlying competition and how like women can be like mean to each other or what have you. And maybe that's just something that's been programmed into us or we're told that that's there. But I really do think that there's something there. And when you bring up this whole aspect of goddesses not taking rejection well, particularly the Venusian goddesses, it really does come through.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're talking about feminine symbolism, and the womb is a container. The womb is a vessel. So the womb wants to be occupied. The container wants something to contain. And so to me, that's part of the symbolism behind woman in general, is that I kind of just symbolically imagine open arms, accepting, embracing, unifying. But if there's nothing to unify with, if there's nothing to embrace, then obviously there isn't that sort of dynamic being fulfilled, right? It's like an empty cup or something along those lines. Versus the man is more so seeking. The phallus seeks. And so to get denied also, right, it's a very similar thing. Men are just more used to it because the power dynamic sexually is that the woman gets to decide who she couples with.
Right.
Right. And the man is allowed to be with that person.
Right. That's very true.
That's just how it works.
Right.
So yeah. So I can see why that's part of mythology. Also, I like what Tom had to say regarding the aquatic relationship with the bull or the cow. That's definitely something that is prevalent. Poseidon having a relationship with the bull, and then also the whole entire idea that I mentioned earlier about the cow being related to cloud symbolism of all things and being related to rain. And in general, too, it's been mentioned already in this episode, but the bull being related to thunder and lightning. And so it's like between thunder, lightning, rain, water in general, the ocean, and earth. I mean, that's insane that Taurus connects to all of these different things.
Today I want to share my thoughts on the archetype of Taurus, which is the most common and familiar name for this fixed earth sign, as it usually refers to the sign of the bull. However, this feminine sign with its strong association with the great Earth Mother Gaia is better represented by the cow, in my opinion, whose horns form a crescent, suggesting the crescent moon, a powerful symbol of the feminine. And Taurus contains all three stages of a woman, maiden, mother, and crone. It is a sign of fertility, sensuality, and the richness of the earth. And moon actually being exalted in this sign adds another layer of the nurturing energy. And actually, I want to add another name to this sign, which is Vacca, which is the Latin word meaning cow. The planet ruling the sign of Taurus is Venus, as well as the dwarf planet Eris. Yet there is another associated dwarf planet, which is Ceres. As we see, the gender of this sign is feminine. The rulers also are, but the word Taurus actually specifically means a male bull. So we see how there is two different energies within the one astrological sign. If the Venusian side of Taurus leans more towards sensuality and love of nature, materialism, and eroticism, the dwarf planet Aries translates from Greek as chaos, and her brother is Mars or Aries, so she carries the same strong warrior-like energy. Another example will include the myth where it says Taurus is Zeus transformed into a white bull to abduct the princess Europa. And another one associated with the constellation Io, a lover of Zeus, whom his wife Juno turned into a cow out of jealousy. So if we think deeper, we understand that the combination of this feminine and masculine energy literally translates into fertility, which is actually associated with the sign of Taurus and the Great Mother once again.
Okay, Alina, thank you so much for that voicemail. You packed in a lot in just a couple of minutes. You reminded me of something very interesting that I have to bring up, and it has to do with what you brought up regarding the Latin word for cow, vaca. And my understanding is it's a very similar word in Spanish and Portuguese. And funny enough, this is actually where we get the word vaccine from. It has to do with early immunizations using cowpox to basically use against smallpox. And so the cowpox dynamic, vaca, actually stuck with immunizations in general. And so all this time later, the vac part of vaccine actually is a reference of all things to the cow, as you mentioned. I also wanted to mention, because you brought up the crescent again, isn't it interesting that we have the crescent moon, and crescent starts with the letter C, and the letter C kind of looks like a crescent moon. Mm-hmm. And then we have cow beginning with C. And as Tom just brought up, there's a lot of cow and bull symbolism that is aquatic in nature. It relates to the sea. It relates to the ocean. So for what it's worth, I just wanted to bring that to the table. And of course, we know that the moon has this deep, deep relationship with water and tides and the ocean and things like that. So the crescent, I just have to mention, once again, the crescent, actually the C of crescent, relating to the crescent itself, right?
Right. And then also, when you're thinking about the sea, the crescent, and the sea itself, cups play a huge role in this, and being the vessels of the water and the containers of that watery energy and the element itself.
Right. Exactly.
And speaking of the relationship of the crescent, a lot of times is always related to the moon, rightfully so. You know, it was brought to my attention a few years ago through a woman named Ola Woolney, who I interviewed, and also she spoke on last year's Taurus episode, but her making the case that those crescents are actually a symbol of Venus, and that the goddesses of ancient past were actually worshiping Venus and not the moon, and that there is a mass inversion with that. And I really do think that there is definitely something to that. Resonates very deeply with me. But as I said, if you want to learn more about that, I highly recommend listening to our episode last year on Taurus, because Ola was one of our special guests and she speaks about that for sure.
Yeah, it's a really interesting weave. Absolutely. And then if you can't get enough, then definitely check out your Healing Home episode where you interviewed her, because there's a lot of intriguing stuff there for sure.
Hi, Mario and Michelle. My name is Sierra, and for Taurus season, I'm leaning into tarot to explore this energy deeper. We are first introduced to Venusian energy in the major arcana with the Empress, and what I like most about this card is a stark contrast between its predecessor, the Emperor. Where the Aries-ruled Emperor had an immediate and clear vision to execute, the Empress really teaches us to fall back a bit and allow things to flourish, the way the entire scene appears on the Empress card. The comfortable energy of the Empress, as expressed through the cushion and the gown she wears, speaks to the be and let be feminine energy that Venus brings. It doesn't hover or micromanage, and there's this sense of trust and understanding with what she commands that asks the same for us during this season. Now, immediately following the Empress is the Hierophant, which is ruled by Taurus. It's the side of Venusian energy that focuses deeper than aesthetics and pleasure. It brings us something to grip onto by way of what we value. On the card, you see the Hierophant elevated on a platform, sitting in between two pillars of Hermes, the messenger god and protector of herds and travelers, and Solomon, the former king of Israel, who was sought after often for his wisdom as a prophet. The Hierophant sitting in between those two energies with a preacher's hand raised speaks to the overall energy of the card. He serves as the quote-unquote traveler who receives divine wisdom from other realms, then brings forth that wisdom in the form of doctrines or sets of rules to honor that energy and abide by. Taurus season grounds us and teaches us to value tradition and symbols as they speak this universal language that connects us to Mother Earth, ourselves, and one another. Thank you so much for your time. Feel free to subscribe to me at the Sacred Pages on Substack, and I hope this helps.
All right, Sierra, thank you so much for that contribution. Great stuff. I'm so glad you brought up tradition. That is a huge, major part of the Hierophant card. He's the keeper of the keys, esoteric doctrines, etc. But he's also the custodian of a tradition. He's keeping this tradition alive. We know that the Hierophant basically is modeled nowadays off of the Catholic Pope. And that person, that figure, essentially, one way of looking at it would be that he's keeping the tradition alive by fulfilling this role, by fulfilling this function. And I just want to mention the fact that as people who live in the West, in the modern world, we very much are in line with new things. People like new everything, new products, new kinds of music, new trends. And this comes at a cost. And so I think that people today, if they find themselves kind of lost in modernity with AI and just kind of the internet age we're living in, one thing that you can fall back on is tradition. You're not going to learn or conjure up anything new that relates to spiritual progress. There are masters and traditions where there's just so much wisdom there that you don't have to search and sort of come up with your own new flavor of it. People have already done that. And so I think the older I get, the more I'm appreciating these different traditions. And I'll say that the tradition that I fall back on is perhaps best described as perennialism, this perennial philosophy that there was an original tradition that all other traditions came out of. And so all of the traditions that you see in today's world actually came from an original one. So it's kind of like a tree, like a world tree, many branches, but one trunk, right? And in this perennial tradition or this perennial philosophy, the idea is that all of these traditions, they're almost like different paths up the same mountain, basically. But I think that a lot of people are kind of turning to traditions actually now more than ever because they see sort of the folly of the modern mindset. And so the Hierophant is there kind of reminding us that there are things to fall back on. There is ancient wisdom that you can basically tap into, and you don't need a guru. You don't need to go out and buy expensive courses. It really, truly is within you, just like what Emily was saying with your inner voice and your inner wisdom.
Totally. Very well said. And what's coming to my mind is kind of what Jord brought up with the connection of natural beauty versus manufactured beauty, or how I'm seeing in this context is traditional beauty versus modern beauty. What is the perception of beauty and how has that been distorted in the modern day? So instead of a woman or a man who's just dressed plainly and is finished a long day of work, there's an attraction to that. That's attractive. But now it's more about you're prim, you're proper, you're all shined up, you got makeup on, or you have gel in your hair, or whatever it is. And that sometimes is looked at as more beautiful than something that's just a natural form of beauty. So that's what comes to mind with that. And then the other thing that I'm thinking about with the whole thought of inventing something new or wanting something new or being the inventor of the thing, I really think that it's more of a display of the egoic attachment people have to being the pioneer of that new thing. Because I think you're very, very spot on with that, of that this has all been done before. This is all here in this realm, kind of for the taking, to be understood on a deeper level. And it's not about who invented it or being the pioneer of it, because that is literally just satisfying that egoic need to be conquering or to be producing, and that action-oriented thing that if you're not doing it, if you're not creating that thing, and if you're not, being the newest, next best thing, then guess what? You're not living your purpose. And as we come to find out, that's actually far, far from the truth.
Yeah, so just to clarify this a little bit, on a spiritual level, it's all been understood. There's nothing new under the sun on that end. What is new is worldly, materialist, novelty-based things.
Wow, right.
That is new. That can be, there's new things conjured up every single day on that end. But on a metaphysical level, it's all been said, it's all been done, it's all been understood for a very, very, very long time. And so that's the difference there.
Wow, I love that. Sierra, I love what you brought to the table here, specifically with the Empress card. And what this makes me think of is how you mentioned the Empress is sitting back. She's kind of waiting. She knows things are okay and things are going through their natural process. And one of the things that makes me think of is a seed and the germination of that seed, and how sometimes we can feel eager for that seed to germinate, or maybe you planted some seeds and you go out there and check every day to see, is it sprouting yet? Has it begun its journey? And what you come to find out as you have a journey with gardening is that there's nothing you can do to speed up that process, because the seed knows exactly what to do. It knows how to do it, and it knows when to do it. It reminds me of the quote that our friend has passed on to us, who has studied a lot in German New Medicine, which is nature doesn't make mistakes. And I think the Empress card basically kind of embodies that, of like, she knows that everything's okay and that things are going to unfold in their natural time when they're supposed to, because that's how it works. Like, God doesn't give you something that you can't or are not prepared to handle. And I think that goes along with that energy for sure.
Right. And, just wanted to say, I'm thinking as you were talking about the Empress card, and in the Rider-Waite version, they usually show the Venus glyph on it looks like a heart, actually.
Yeah, it's like almost like a shield, like she's wearing, or she's holding a shield.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And then if I'm not mistaken, in the Rider-Waite as well, I think there's some pillows that are kind of making like a throne. I've actually put out there that it seems as though they might be alluding to a birthing chair.
Oh, yes.
But the pattern on some of the pillows actually looks like a Venus glyph as well. So they're definitely encoding Venusian energy in that card, for sure.
What does Taurus mean to me? Well, to me, Taurus is earth, it's grounding, it's also connected to feminine energy. In human design, gate 2 is the gate of the driver, and it's all about purpose and direction, and it's in the self center. This gate also very deeply connects with the energy of magnetism and direction, and Tauruses are very grounded, very attracted to the earth. So that to me represents our desire for material pleasures and love and things that are like worldly to a degree, or secular.
All right, Nicole, thank you so much for that contribution there. I'm glad you're bringing human design to the table, and you're saying that it represents this driving sort of dynamic, giving you direction, right? And whenever I think about this, I always think of orientation, right? Are you oriented in space? Do you know where you're going? Are you going south, north, east, west? Do you have any clue where you're at on the map? So this all has to do with orientation. And to me, you want to be oriented around your center. And it's interesting, too, that centaur, what I've talked about before is that tar is a reference to Taurus. So target. That actually is a reference to the bull's eye. And centaur is a reference to, or what it means rather, is bull killer. And so when Sagittarius, the centaur of the zodiac, when Sagittarius is rising, the bull is falling. Similarly, when Scorpio is rising, the same thing is happening. And so centaur reminds me of center, and that is where you want to be located so that you have orientation. And so if you're being pulled in all different directions and influenced by all sorts of people and everything you're seeing online and everything you're seeing out in public, to me, this is the best way to get lost, but if you're centered and you have orientation from within, that is actually how you find your path. That is how you find your true north. And as I've been saying, there's a lot of interesting symbolism with Taurus representing that central fixed axis, which is essentially your point of pivot, your center, and what's going to allow you to drive to where you want to go, actually. All right, guys, this is going to do it for this Taurus episode. Thank you so much for hanging out. I hope you got something out of that. We will see you soon for an episode on the symbolism of Gemini.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, this wraps up the live recording Michelle and I made on Friday, April 24th. Taurus is such a massive, beautiful sign, however, we had to do a companion episode where Michelle and I unpack even more information about all things Taurian. We're calling this show After Hours, and it'll be a new exclusive for members moving forward. We got into all sorts of stuff, including the nature of bull sacrifice, and I really unpacked the symbolism of the bull being a creature at the center of creation, amongst other things, of course. We had a great time recording it. Keep an eye out for that if you're wanting even more information on Taurus. Many thanks to our regular contributors, Emily and Katriena. You guys make this wheel go round. And a big thank you to our special guests this episode, Jord and Noah. Tom came through with an excellent voicemail as well, as did a few of our listeners. Jord can be found on YouTube and X under the handle WarJord. Noah can be found on Patreon at Facing North Astrology. He's also on YouTube at Facing North is where you can find him. Katriena can be found at the Venus Diaries on Substack or at katrienaemmanuel.com. Emily Ridout can be found at astroyoga.org or emilyridout.com. Tom can be found on Instagram at tmackey1018 or on Quora, tom-mac-69. For exclusive content, grab a Symbolic Studies membership, either on Patreon, YouTube, Substack, or my site. They all host the same exclusives, including 19 symbolic lectures on the tarot. Membership also gets you early access to the podcast. Without a doubt, this is the best way to keep up with everything I have to offer, and it's just $5 a month. Also, in case you weren't aware, I am available for tarot readings, private lessons, and I just launched a mentorship program for students who want to learn symbolism over a long-term basis. Also, I have to mention again the fact that symbolism came across my radar due to being a graphic designer. I've been designing for nearly 30 years, so if you're in need of creative assistance with your project, check out my portfolio on the site and get in touch. Links to all my accounts can be found at symbolicstudies.com, including my Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, etc. And that's going to do it for this episode. We'll see you next month with the show on the symbolism of Gemini. Until then.